U.S. President Barack Obama says the U.S. government will no longer threaten to prosecute families who try to pay ransom to win the release of American hostages held overseas. Christine Domingo tells us why.
In America, U.S. President Barack Obama said on Wednesday that the U.S. government will no longer threaten to prosecute families who try to pay ransom to win the release of American hostages held overseas, and that the United States will directly negotiate with militants holding them but will not pay ransom. The policy changes the way the government handles cases in which Americans are taken hostage by groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. The announcement follows a 6-month review prompted by sharp criticism of the Obama administration by some victims' relatives who said they had been threatened with prosecution if they tried to raise money to pay a ransom. As the president unveiled the changes to the nation's hostage policy, he said that while the U.S. government should do everything in its power to rescue Americans held abroad, it will not pay ransoms.
I firmly believe that the United States government paying ransom to terrorists risks endangering more Americans and funding the very terrorism that we're trying to stop. And so I firmly believe that our policy ultimately puts fewer Americans at risk.
Obama said the administration is creating an interagency fusion cell with personnel from the FBI, Pentagon, and State Department to address hostage situations in a more comprehensive way. Unlike some European allies, the United States insists it will not make concessions to hostage takers and has a strict no-payment strategy, saying ransoms only encourage further kidnappings and put funds in the hands of the militants. According to U.S. and British officials, over the past decade, European governments are believed to have paid militant groups more than $100 million in ransoms. Meanwhile, Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev on Wednesday apologized for the deadly 2013 attack at a hearing, and a U.S. judge formally sentenced him to death for killing 4 people and injuring 264 in the bombing and its aftermath. Tsarnaev, 21, addressed a courtroom packed with parents of some of the dead and some of those wounded on April 15, 2013. It was the first time that Tsarnaev, who did not speak in his own defense during his trial, had addressed the court. Tsarnaev had been found guilty for the marathon bombing, as well as fatally shooting a police officer 3 days later. The same federal jury that convicted him in April voted for the death penalty in May. The bombing was one of the highest-profile attacks on U.S. soil since September 11, 2001. Christine Domingo reporting for Y News.
Scientists in the United Arab Emirates recently discovered that juvenile camels are the key source of the Middle East respiratory syndrome. Ann Nunez tells us why.
Scientists in the Central Veterinary Research Laboratory in the United Arab Emirates recently discovered that the juvenile camels are the key source of the Middle East respiratory syndrome, MERS. The laboratory is one of the most developed immunology labs in the Middle East. A lot of researches had been done by the lab in an attempt to find the source of MERS virus and to identify ways in which human infections can be prevented. The first case of human MERS infection was reported in June last year. The researchers have collected serum samples from over 1,000 camels of different ages in different regions and tested if there was MERS virus in them. The results shows all these dromedary camels carry antibodies to MERS.
What we found out was adult camels, like mothers, have antibodies, 100%. That means that during their life, they got in contact with the virus and produced antibodies. And more or less, they are immune.
Werner said the risk of infection is from camel cubs.
The virus is in the small animal. So they get the milk from the mother. In the mother's milk are antibodies against MERS to protect them during the first weeks, first months. Yeah? And then the antibodies disappear. And then they are prone to any disease. And when they have no antibodies, the virus then gets into these camel calves
Although there was no evidence that could confirm animals pass MERS virus to humans, Wernery speculated camel cubs could pass the virus to humans during the period when they carry no antibodies. Ann Nunez reporting for Y News.